In this very moment, ask yourself a simple question: am I truly awake? Not in the physical sense, but awake to life, to truth, to yourself. You see, we walk through our lives wearing invisible masks. We perform roles, follow routines, repeat habits. Yet rarely do we pause and ask, is this really who I am? Awakening begins when you stop living on autopilot and start questioning your inner truth. Most people wake up every day and immediately fall into patterns they've never consciously chosen. The alarm rings, the phone is checked, the mind is flooded with to-do lists, responsibilities, and the expectations of others. And so, the day begins, not as a fresh opportunity, but as a continuation of the same story that's been running for years. This story, for many, is not written with awareness. It's a script handed down by society, shaped by childhood conditioning, molded by fear, and reinforced by habit. Autopilot is not just a mode of convenience. It becomes a silent trap. It convinces you that everything is fine, that this is just how life is, that everyone else is doing the same, so it must be okay. But deep within, there's often a quiet discomfort, a faint voice that says something isn't right. The problem is, this voice gets drowned out. Drowned by noise, by business, by distraction. By the time you notice it, you're already rushing from one task to another, one screen to the next, one conversation to the next performance. In this state, there is no space to question, no pause to reflect. But awakening begins the moment you do pause, when you stop mid-thought, mid-routine, and ask yourself, not what do I have to do today, but who am I, why am I doing this? What do I really believe? These questions may seem simple, but they are dangerous to the ego. They are not surface-level inquiries. They dig deep. They challenge the roles you've identified with. They shake the foundation of a life built on external approval. When you begin to question your inner truth, you're no longer satisfied with shallow answers. You begin to see the difference between movement and progress, between being busy and being alive, between comfort and growth. And in this space, the inner truth starts to rise. It doesn't shout. It doesn't come with fanfare. It emerges in silence, in those moments when you're brave enough to disconnect from the noise and reconnect with yourself. This process is not easy. It's not glamorous, but it's real. It may start as discomfort. You may realize that some of your goals were never yours to begin with, that the life you're chasing was built to impress, not to fulfill, that your idea of success was inherited, not chosen. And as painful as these realizations are, they are the beginning of something powerful. Because once you see the illusion, you can't unsee it. Once you question the lie, it loses its grip. From that point on, your decisions change. Not all at once, but gradually. You begin to seek meaning, not just money, connection, not just validation, purpose, not just praise. You start to value solitude, not as loneliness, but as clarity. You begin to trust your inner voice, even when it contradicts the crowd. And with each act of awareness, each choice made with intention, the autopilot fades. You become more present, more grounded, more real. You begin to notice the little things, the tone of your thoughts, the energy of your actions, the quality of your presence. Life stops being a race and becomes a practice of noticing, of choosing, of returning to yourself. And though the world outside still moves fast, your inner world begins to slow down. You find yourself watching rather than reacting, observing rather than clinging. You create space between the impulse and the response, between the emotion and the reaction. And in that space, truth speaks. True clarity comes from stillness, not from the noise of the world. In modern life, the external world never stops moving. There is always another message, another headline, another notification begging for attention. The moment you open your eyes, the mind is already racing to keep up. You are pulled into the whirlwind of tasks, expectations, comparisons, and opinions. It feels like movement, like progress, but much of it is just motion without meaning. And yet, in this storm of activity, people seek answers. They chase clarity in chaos, hoping that if they just move fast enough, they will arrive at truth. But truth doesn't live in the noise. It never has. The world teaches you that doing more leads to knowing more, that activity will eventually lead to understanding. But some of the most important truths are revealed not when you add more, but when you subtract, when you step away, when you become still. Stillness is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is a deliberate state, a space where your inner vision sharpens, because there is nothing else crowding it. In stillness, the fog of distraction begins to lift. The layers of false urgency begin to peel away, and what remains is what has always been there, patiently waiting beneath the surface, your own awareness. Stillness is not something that can be forced. It's not a switch you flip. It's something you allow, something you sink into when you stop grasping for answers from the outside, when you stop looking for validation from others, when you let the mind settle, like mud in water, and finally see through the bottom. Clarity doesn't scream. It arrives when the inner noise has quieted down enough for you to hear what has always been whispering. It is not complicated. It is not dramatic. It is deeply simple. But because it is so simple, the mind often overlooks it. In stillness, you begin to see how many of your thoughts are not yours, how many of your beliefs are borrowed, how much of your identity is shaped by what others have said, done, or expected. And suddenly, in that silence, you are able to separate what is real from what is reaction. You begin to feel the difference between intuition and impulse, between wisdom and worry, between presence and pretense. It becomes clear that many of the things you were chasing were not needs. They were noise. This kind of clarity doesn't arrive with effort alone. It arrives with surrender, not giving up, but giving in, to the moment, to awareness, to the truth that arises when the dust of mental chatter has settled. Stillness does not mean the absence of thought, but the absence of attachment to thought. It allows you to watch the mind without becoming it, to observe your emotions without drowning in them, to create space between experience and interpretation. In this space, truth becomes visible. You begin to see patterns that were hidden in plain sight. Reactions that were automatic now become conscious. You start to notice where your energy leaks, what drains you, what fuels you, what aligns with you, and what does not. You begin to realize that clarity was never missing. It was simply buried. Buried under layers of urgency, expectation, noise, and speed. And each moment of stillness is a moment of excavation, a digging beneath the surface to uncover what is timeless, what is essential, what is true. Stillness is not separate from life. It is the very essence of a conscious life. It is the ground from which real decisions grow, the place from which authentic action arises. When you act from stillness, there is alignment. When you speak from stillness, there is power. When you listen from stillness, there is understanding. And once you've tasted that level of clarity, the noise of the world loses its power over you. Your biggest limitations are often invisible patterns and beliefs you never examined. These patterns don't come announced. They don't scream for your attention. They live quietly beneath your awareness, guiding your choices, shaping your reactions, defining what you think is possible. You wake up each day believing you are deciding freely, but much of what you do is based on old scripts, written years ago by experiences you barely remember. Beliefs formed in childhood, shaped by society, reinforced by repetition. These beliefs turn into unconscious rules. Rules about who you are, what you're worth, what you can or cannot achieve, and how life is supposed to unfold. The most dangerous limits are not the ones placed on you by the world. They are the ones you place on yourself without even realizing it. You say, "This is just how I am," not knowing that the version of you you're defending was created out of fear or survival. You convince yourself, "I can't do this," or "I'm not that type of person," without questioning where those ideas came from. Often, they weren't yours to begin with. They were borrowed, absorbed, inherited. But over time, they feel like truth, and truth, once believed without question, becomes a wall. These invisible walls are tricky. You can't fight them if you can't see them. You can't free yourself from a prison you don't even know you're in. That is why awareness is so important. Awareness is the light that exposes what's been hidden. And when you shine that light inward, when you begin to look with honest eyes, you start to notice the patterns. You notice how you react the same way in similar situations, even when you want a different outcome. You notice how you shrink when it's time to speak, how you overthink when it's time to act, how you sabotage joy when things feel too good. These patterns are not accidents. They were formed through repetition, through emotional imprinting, through stories that were repeated often enough to become identities. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive, so now you hide your emotions. Maybe you failed once and were laughed at, so now you avoid all risks. Maybe you grew up around scarcity, so now you never feel like you have enough, even when you do. These beliefs shape your energy. They dictate your boundaries. They determine how much love you accept, how much success you allow, how much peace you believe you deserve. Breaking free begins with the willingness to look inward, to ask, not, what's wrong with the world, but, what stories am I still carrying? It requires courage, not the kind that charges forward blindly, but the kind that stands still and dares to see the truth. Sometimes that truth is uncomfortable. It reveals how you've been your own obstacle, how your suffering didn't just come from others, but from the thoughts you've repeated to yourself 1,000 times. But within that discomfort lies power, because what was once unconscious can now be chosen. The moment you recognize a limiting pattern, you are no longer fully under its control. It may still show up, it may still whisper, but you are watching now, you are awake to it, and that awareness changes everything. Now, you can pause before reacting. Now, you can question the belief before accepting it. Now, you can ask, is this true? And is this useful? Instead of blindly obeying a rule you didn't write. With each layer of belief that you peel back, you uncover a deeper self. Not the one shaped by fear, but the one shaped by possibility. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about freeing yourself, not from who you are, but from who you are not, from who you thought you had to be. And the more you do this inner work, the more you realize that many of your limits were never real. They were inherited thoughts, emotional echoes, protective strategies. And now that you see them, you don't have to live by them anymore. Opening your eyes to truth requires courage, discomfort, and self-honesty. It is not a peaceful awakening where everything becomes light and joy. Often, the first glimpse of truth is like a cold wind, unforgiving, raw, and impossible to ignore. Truth is not always beautiful in the beginning. It can show you parts of yourself you've avoided, decisions you've justified, habits you've protected, and illusions you've depended on. Most people think they want truth, but what they often want is comfort. Comfort feels safe, familiar, predictable. Truth does not guarantee safety, it guarantees clarity. And clarity is not always comfortable. There's a reason why people hide behind distractions, why silence makes them anxious, and why introspection is often postponed. Because to truly look within is to risk seeing something they don't like, something that might require change, something that might dismantle the story they've been telling themselves. And change, even when necessary, is threatening to the identity you've worn for years. That identity, even if built on falsehoods or limitations, gives a sense of structure. It tells you who you are, even if that version of you is unfulfilled. Letting go of that identity can feel like stepping into a void. It takes courage to walk into that void without knowing what version of yourself will emerge on the other side. Discomfort is the price of transformation. Growth is not a gentle process. It stretches you, cracks you, exposes you. There are moments when facing truth will feel like betrayal, not to others, but to your old self. The part of you that stayed quiet to keep the peace. The part of you that settled to feel secure. The part of you that accepted less because more felt out of reach. When you begin to see through those patterns, when you recognize the compromises, a wave of discomfort arises. You may feel regret. You may feel guilt. You may feel lost. But those emotions are not signs that you're on the wrong path. They are signs that you're finally seeing the path clearly. Self-honesty is not about judgment. It's not about labeling yourself as good or bad. It's about seeing things as they are, not as you wish they were. It's about being able to say, yes, I have been pretending, or yes, I have been avoiding this truth, without turning away. When you look at your life with honest eyes, you start to notice how many choices were made out of fear rather than freedom. How many of your routines are driven by survival rather than intention. How many times you said yes to others while saying no to yourself. These realizations are not comfortable, but they are necessary. To open your eyes to truth is to accept that some people, some paths, and some beliefs no longer belong in your life. It may mean walking away from things you once depended on. It may mean being misunderstood. It may mean standing alone for a while. But there is a difference between loneliness and alignment. Being alone in truth is far more powerful than being surrounded in illusion. That solitude creates space for you to build something real. Something not based on fear or approval, but on authenticity. The path of truth is not loud. It doesn't beg for attention. It quietly invites you to see, not just what's around you, but what's within you. It requires you to question even your most sacred assumptions, to revisit your definitions of success, love, strength, happiness, to confront your shadows without shame. And each time you do, each time you face a truth without running from it, you reclaim a part of yourself, the part that knows, the part that doesn't need validation, the part that isn't afraid of being wrong, because it's more committed to growth than to ego. Transformation is not about becoming more, but about removing what you are not. In a world constantly urging you to improve, to add, to upgrade yourself, it's easy to believe that growth means piling on more layers, more knowledge, more skills, more achievements, more opinions, more roles. But real transformation often works in the opposite direction. It is a process of peeling away, of subtraction, of letting go. Because beneath all the layers you've accumulated, of fear, conditioning, expectations, and ego, there is a version of you that is already whole. The task is not to build that self, but to uncover it. The false self is constructed over time. Every time you pretend to be someone you're not to fit in. Every time you say yes when your soul screams no. Every time you accept a belief just because it's popular. Each one of these moments adds another mask, another layer, another filter between you and your authentic self. And as these layers grow, they become heavy. They distort your view of the world. They create noise between your thoughts and your truth. You may still move forward in life, but with effort, confusion, and resistance, because you're carrying parts of you that don't belong to you. Transformation begins when you stop asking, what more do I need to be? And start asking, what can I release that's not really me? This question requires a different kind of courage. Not the kind that charges ahead, but the kind that sits still and listens. It takes strength to unlearn. It takes patience to untangle years of programming. It takes trust to believe that what remains after letting go will be enough. Most people are afraid to strip away what they know, even if it's painful. Because the known, no matter how limiting, feels safer than the unknown. The stories you've been telling yourself, even the ones that cause suffering, create identity. And identity feels like security. But if the identity is built on wounds, fears, or roles you never chose, it becomes a cage. Freedom doesn't come from decorating the cage with better habits or more confidence. It comes from realizing the cage was never locked and stepping out of it. To remove what you are not means to let go of needing to prove anything. You stop chasing external validation because you realize worth doesn't need to be earned. It needs to be remembered. You stop performing and start being. You begin to notice how many of your thoughts are not rooted in the present moment, but in old fears and future projections. You see how much of your energy goes into maintaining an image rather than living in truth. You notice how often you wear masks and how tiring it is to keep switching them. With each layer you release, you come closer to your natural state, peaceful, clear, unburdened. You begin to act from intention, not reaction. You begin to speak with your own voice, not one borrowed from others. You begin to live from within, not for the world's applause. And in this space, things start to change. Not because you've become someone new, but because you've stopped being someone you're not. This is the paradox of transformation. You don't become more, you become less. Less tense, less reactive, less afraid, less attached to identities that were never true. What remains is not emptiness. What remains is essence. It's who you were before the world told you who to be. And from that essence, everything flows naturally. Clarity arises without forcing. Strength emerges without pretending. Joy returns without chasing. You begin to feel light, not because the world changed, but because you stopped carrying what wasn't yours. In just a few moments of deep self-reflection, your entire direction in life can shift. Not because the world around you changes, but because your way of seeing it changes. A single thought, a single realization, a sudden moment of clarity can break the pattern of years. People often believe that transformation requires years of planning, constant action, and visible progress. But real inner shifts rarely follow that timeline. They happen in moments of stillness, in seconds of truth, when something deep inside you wakes up and says, "This is not the path I want to continue walking." Reflection is not about sitting in silence to escape life. It's about returning to life with greater awareness. Most people live in reaction. Reaction to their environment, their upbringing, their pain, their desires. But when you pause and reflect, you create space between stimulus and response. In that space you discover choice. That's where power lives. It's not in controlling the outside world. It's in realizing you have control over your response, your perception, your attitude, and your next step. This realization alone can shift the course of a life that felt stuck for years. The direction of your life isn't determined by massive external events as much as it is by internal decisions. Quiet ones, the kind that no one else sees. The kind that happen in your mind when you decide that you are no longer going to carry a certain belief. When you forgive someone, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. When you let go of a version of yourself you've been clinging to just to meet someone else's expectations. These are not dramatic moments, but they are decisive ones. And a single decisive moment of self-awareness can redirect the entire flow of your life. This is why reflection is not optional. It is essential. Without it, you drift. You repeat yesterday unconsciously. You move, but you don't evolve. You achieve, but you don't feel fulfilled. You stay busy, but disconnected. A moment of true reflection acts like a mirror that shows you not only where you are, but how you got there. It asks you to stop blaming and start owning. It strips away the excuses, the stories, and the illusions. And when you look honestly, without judgment, you gain something far more valuable than comfort. You gain clarity. You begin to notice the decisions you made out of fear rather than purpose. You recognize which relationships uplift you and which ones drain you. You see where your energy flows and where it leaks. You become conscious of the moments when you betrayed your own intuition just to avoid discomfort. All of this awareness becomes fuel for transformation, because you cannot change what you do not see. But once you see it clearly, even for a brief moment, the shift begins. It doesn't take a lifetime to wake up. It takes a moment of honesty, a pause, a breath, One question asked with sincerity, one truth accepted without resistance. It's not about quantity of reflection, but depth. 10 minutes of genuine presence can reveal more than 10 years of mindless motion. When you are truly present with yourself, the distractions fall away, the noise fades, the masks drop, and what remains is raw, undeniable, and often very simple. A knowing, a realization, a call to move differently. This is where transformation is born. Not in noise, not in rush, but in the quiet recognition that you are free to choose again. To release the path you've been on, and to take a new one with intention. Not because you are forced to, but because you see now, you see where you are, you see who you've become, you see what you've outgrown. And that seeing is enough to shift the energy of your entire life. What if the breakthrough you've been waiting for isn't somewhere in the distant future, but right here, hidden in your own awareness? The most eye-opening moments of life don't arrive through noise, achievement, or approval. They arrive in stillness, in reflection, in the quiet courage to question what you've believed, what you've followed, and who you've pretended to be. When you pause long enough to listen, truly listen, not to the world, but to yourself, you begin to uncover a deeper truth. That your limits were often illusions. That your identity was shaped by stories, not reality. That your power was never lost. It was just buried under layers you didn't know you were carrying. This journey is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you are without the masks, without the noise, without the fear. It's about recognizing that transformation is not something you chase. It's something you allow when you're brave enough to let go. And sometimes all it takes is 10 minutes of truth to begin a lifetime of clarity.